Welcome to the 6th BAFA Accounting History Special Interest Group Virtual Workshop, 18th January 2022.
Happy New Year to everyone, and welcome to the first of our accounting history SIG events for 2022. We're desperately hoping that it will be a mixture of online presentations, but also some face-to-face, and we're just keeping our fingers crossed that can happen. So there'll be, further details along the line about all our events. So today we've got three incredibly interesting presentations. Julia second, and then Chris third. Slight change of plan for the first one. Unfortunately, Jill is unable to be with us today, and so at incredibly short notice, i.e. yesterday, Karen has very kindly stepped in at the last minute, and we really appreciate that, Karen. And we also all appreciate how little time you've had to present, so looking forward to that one as well. I'll now hand over to Alistair, who will be chairing the sessions, and then at the end we'll have Matt, who will sum up and close the proceedings. So enjoy, everyone, and over to Alistair.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Shraddha. We're delighted to see so many people here this morning. It's great to have you with us. I shall introduce Karen McBride. Can I hand over? We have got 25 minutes for your presentation. Karen, can I hand over to you?
This paper is very much a joint effort, which I say a joint effort, but actually Jill has done an awful lot of work on it. It started off as the editorial paper for our special issue of AAAJ, and it has grown. Jill had the amazing idea of looking at rock art, and so it has now grown into two papers. So there's the editorial paper, and there's another paper called Exploring the Historical Roots. The other paper is now called Accounting from the Dawn of Human Consciousness, an exploration of rock art accounts through the views of informants and other. So the purpose of the paper is to broaden the agenda for environmental and ecological accounting research, and that's going back into the past. So we always seem to treat environmental accounting as if it happened after normal accounting. But in fact, what we're suggesting with this paper is environmental accounting may very well have been the first form of accounting. We locate the paper at the intersection of research into accounting history into environmental and ecological accounting. The specific aims of the paper are to explore the environmental roots, the historical roots of environmental and ecological accounting, and to demonstrate, as I said, rather than being secondary and relatively recent development that emerged from financial reporting, that it actually predated financial accounting by thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. And so thereby extending the form of environmental and ecological accounting. And we're going to make some suggestions for new pathways as well for researchers to look at this. So what this is doing, it's demonstrating the diverse cultural and international roots of environmental and ecological accounting. So often environmental accounting may not include ecology. Now, what ecology is, it's a branch of biology dealing with the relationships between organisms, one to another, and their physical surroundings. And quite often environmental accounting focuses on things like carbon disclosures, water usage, etc., and all those things that we've become very familiar with. Ecological accounting aims to bring the nature back into the accounting, And we can also look at something known as deep ecology, which is the belief that instead of humans accounting for nature in regards to their own purposes for nature and valuing it based on how they might use it, to try and value it for its own sake, for its own value. So this paper is hoping to broaden the definition of that in relation to accounting. So there's lots of, an amount of ecological accounting research. Russell, for example, discusses nature writings as illustrations of ecological accounts. What we mean by ecological accounts is this idea of thinking about nature. So we're accounting for externalities and human impacts on nature, as well as just accounting for nature in terms of how humans can use nature. So it's accounts of nature, valuing nature for nature's sake, and accounts in the broadest form of non-human life. So flora, fauna, biodiversity, and extinction accounting as well, which is obviously Jill's area. So we can look at broadly defining ecological accounting and accounts. And we can look at what is lost in these accounts within our scholarship. Are we bound to study only economic entities, or can we find another value for this flora and fauna and nature? So Jill has been working for some time in this area. Examples of this are hers and Ian Thompson's 19th century account of river pollution, and their account of a wood. There's also other work in this area, Day and Russell's account of rivers, blanket bogs, ecological accounting frameworks, and other ecological accounts looking at, for example, Lane and Vinari, their Finnish study, looking at where pigs and chickens were being kept, and they produced a counter visual account of what was actually happening. So these are accounts by interested parties, external often to the company, and stakeholders with ecological issues and trying to bring things to the fore related to companies and to do with ecological issues and ecosystems. There's a history of academic research into accounting for biodiversity, but what is biodiversity? And the Convention on Biological Diversity suggests that the variability among living organisms from all sources, including, amongst other things, terrestrial, maritime, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they're a part. So including diversity within species, between systems and ecosystems. And early papers provided an exploratory framework for effectively looking at and auditing biodiversity. So Mike Jones's paper, Accounting for Biodiversity, and then there was a special issue as well of AAAJ looking at accounting for biodiversity in 2013. So around 10 years ago, academic research began to explore accounting for biodiversity practice. There's been an increasing quantity of biodiversity related information reported by companies in either their sustainability reports or more recently in their integrated annual reports. I mentioned that there was a special issue of AAAJ in 2013, and this considered the nature and motivation of this reporting. So there's been a general consensus that accounting for biodiversity has been dominated by impression management. And in a moment, when I get to our paper in a little bit more detail, you'll see that that was also the case back in the time of rock art as well. So a seminal paper in this area was problematizing biodiversity. Jill has also published other papers, including one on rhinoceros counting, on building an ark, no, not how to build an ark, but looking at integrated extinction, accounting and accountability. And this extends ecological accounting historically into different forms and has led to calls from the accounting history literature to look at environmental and ecological accounting. So Carnegie and Napier, how early individuals and organizations used accounting. So we should be looking at how earlier individuals and organizations used accounting to enable, or in some cases to ignore, sustainability and hold the powerful accountable for their impact on nature. So calls for further exploration of environmental accounting in a historical context. One of Jill's papers in this area is her work along with Warren Maron on Gilbert White, looking at the roots of accounting for biodiversity and extinction accounting. And they looked at the Naturalist Journal of Gilbert White and represented those as biodiversity accounts. Oh, and there's also a paper which Jill and myself have recently had published in AAAJ, which is looking at John Evelyn's Fumifungium from 1661, which we characterize as an external social account bearing resemblance to contemporary accounting, but looking at pollution in 17th century London. So lots of background to this particular area, and Jill also has doctoral students that are looking at extinction accounting as well, some looking at accounting for pandas, hedgehogs, orangutans, and then another looking at extinction accounting in Brazil. So linked to this, there is also the literature around ancient accounting and the idea of rock art and the idea of recording animals. And specifically in this paper, we do look at animals as opposed to people in terms of accounting on rock art. We're interested in the ecological, so the nature and the situation of the animals. And what is quite interesting is that the animals often don't appear with flora and fauna around them. They often appear as just the animals in a piece of rock art. There's a Sumerian tablet which recorded 92 ewes, 20 rams, 22 breeding lambs, and so on. So they recorded quite clearly the contents or the animals that made up a herd. In the later Mesopotamian period, some systems used as much as 60 different symbols for different animals. So you've got this idea of symbolism for representing animals. So first counting, and all of this happened around the same sort of time as first writing and first recording of things around the people. I've just managed to skip, so I need to go. Oh, for goodness sake. Yes. So rock art can be seen as accounts of animals, of species, of biodiversity, and is quite often now used to look at accounts of extinction. So some animals which were recorded at the time on the rock no longer exist, and anthropologists and others can use this information to see animals which are now extinct. We're extending the prior literature, which I've just talked about, by drawing on rock art as representing a source of the very, very earliest accounts recorded by humans at the dawn of writing, reading by members of the human race. We focus on depictions of animals in rock art and in cave art. And these animals are quite often, you can see the progress of them being represented by symbols or marking or actual pictures. And the very first one is an actual picture. I will show you a picture of that in a minute. The overwhelming majority of rock art constitutes depictions of animals. So animals not within their environment, but the single animal or sole animal or herds of animals. So this paper aims to explore the ecological and environmental accounts rather than the social accounts. So we're not really as interested in the recording of people here, although we do look at it very briefly in terms of hunting of animals, but we are interested in the animals themselves and how they were recorded. Rock art can be parietal art, which is literally art on the walls and includes ceilings and floors, or it can be petroglyphs, includes petroglyphs, which are created by carving, pecking, or picking at the rock face. And rock art has been discovered in over 100 countries, so it's global. From the very earliest times, man has felt that urge to leave his imprint, and what he's left his imprint is showing the animals around him. And in this way, the very earliest rock carvings came into being. So for the paper, we use the term rock art, although this includes, as I said, just pecking away at the rock to make recordings or carving away at the rock. So it's paintings, engravings, as well as the art on open air cliff faces and boulders. So the very, very earliest human account showing a pig was 35,400 years ago. And this was a pig in Indonesia, and it was hidden away in a damp cave in the other side, on the other side of the world in Indonesia. Well, not the other side of the world for some people here. It's not so far from Australians that are participating. So 35,000 years ago, and this could be the first ecological account. Other previous examples of rock art, before this was found, it was believed that the Lascaux paintings, which were around 17,300 years ago, were the oldest. Could that person please switch off their mic as they come in, please? Levantine art refers to over 700 prehistoric rock sites in the Spanish Mediterranean, and animal engravings in rock art in the Sahara are 6,300 to 1,000 BC. And then there are rock art panels in southwest Libya. So throughout the world, oh, sorry, I'll just shot through those really quickly. Go back to the Hall of the Bulls in Lascaux in France. The Levantine art of deer hunting. And actually the deer looks as if it's hunting the man there rather than the other way around. Rock art animal accounts in Libya. So paleontologists, archaeologists and anthropologists have started using this rock and rock art as accounts of species to work out where there are gaps in our knowledge. And wild camel, lesser kudu, African wild ass and other animals have been identified, and animals that now no longer exist. The cave art in Spain represents many local species, and the Great Hunt panel in Utah shows the outcome of prehistoric human hunting. So you can see the animals there being hunted. So the question, or one of the questions we're asking in this paper is, why did prehistoric people produce rock art accounts? They could have been accounts of past hunting successes. They could have been to conjure up more animals for hunting magic. There are lots of pictures of giraffes, but it's known that giraffes were not that prevalent. So it may well be that they wanted to see giraffes, they wanted to hunt giraffes, they're using the rock art to conjure up these animals. Religious motivation is another possibility. Totemism, shamanism. For amusement or pleasure or even for teaching purposes, the rock art could have been used. And the symbolic value of the images, the reason for the production of the accounts, such as the high frequency of cattle and giraffe depictions, relate to their symbolic value as well. So these were important animals to them, so they wanted to represent them in their art and recreating what was around them. So we have looked at similar philosophical strands between accounting and rock art literature. So accounting talks a lot about communication and language, and this is the same for the rock art. It can be about communication and language. And these rock art accounts and the accountants that produced them are thought to have been linked to the evolution of language, and so they're communicating their assets, if you like. Some rock art and views the images as texts, breaking the artwork down into grammar and sentences and seeing actual stories being told through the rock art. And there's been substantial accounting literature on Egyptian hieroglyphs which tell of the peoples and the stories around them. And it seems quite valid to explore these earlier texts of communication in their forms of account. So
Karen, you've got about 2.5 minutes left.
Brilliant.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. So I'm going to skip Baudrillard. I wasn't planning on doing that anyway. That's not my area. So I talked very, very briefly about impression management in rock art accounts. The fact that quite often the animal depictions show animals that we know were not in huge abundance, but which they wished might be in huge abundance, even for hunting or because they were interested in them. So this is an extension of historical ecological accounting, and we can look at various forms of artwork to try and see forms of accounting: weaving, embroidery, mosaics, African depictions of animals, Japanese prints, company accounting, for example, the East India Company. And I know some people have done this. Francis and Andrew, for example, have looked at the Bayeux tapestry. So we can see animals in ancient mosaics, in company paintings. And so we make a suggestion to explore other media as ecological accounts. We can look at literature, we can look at poetry, and I know Lorenzo Giamili has been looking at some areas of poetry in terms of ecological accounts, travel diaries, which Anne has looked at, music, nature diaries, and nature writing. So the fieldwork bit of this, Warren took some interviews, he took some photos and has done some interviews of current peoples in areas in South Africa where there's very, very old rock art. So here is the prehistoric rock art in South Africa. And finally, to finish with a little advert, so we are welcoming submissions for papers for exploring the historical roots of environmental and ecological accounting, along with some of these ideas that I've suggested today. Do think about exploring this and putting in a paper for this call of papers for AAAJ. The deadline is the 30th of June.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, Karen. And your timing was just absolutely spot on and perfect. So thank you very much for that. We now have 5 minutes for the discussant, who is Hafez Abdo, who I can see is here and is unmuted already. So Hafez, good morning to you. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. Thank you very much. Can I hand over to you?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Karen, for presenting this amazing paper. I had the opportunity to read much of it last night and enjoyed listening to your presentation. This is a very good example of a multidisciplinary study which marry between accounting and rock art, which is fascinating. I myself, I never came across such a thing before. So thank you to Jill and the team. I would believe this paper is going to be a key reference for both environmental accounting and accounting history, because it's just innovative in its approach. Also, the literature review itself being conducted very well. So it opened doors for future studies on externalities, where we can link tax, we can link ecological accounting, etc., ecology, ecosystem, etc., and all of this can be actually linked to sustainable development goals. So we are back to accounting, sustainability, and SDG. Also, the way that the paper tackled the issue by linking the rock art into the accounting history and into the modern accounting make a beautiful link with environmental accounting in a historical context, which can be linked easily to corporate social responsibility and, as I said, taxation too in some way. So these are the notes I made. Thank you very much for this beautiful work, actually, and for sharing it with us today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for your comments there, Hafez. You've given us plenty to think about. Karen, before I invite general questions, was there anything you wanted to respond to, or any points you wanted to highlight of what Hafez has just said?
It sounded very complimentary, so no, thank you. bring on the difficult questions.
Just accept it and move on. Okay.
I see Andrew is waving his hand, so I'm sure Andrew's got a difficult question.
Okay, we've got until 9:40 for questions. So, and yeah, sorry, I can see Andrew's got his hand up. So, Andrew, may I invite a question from you, please?
Yeah, a couple of questions. I'm not sure if you were in on the session at AFADS last year, where Francis and I presented a paper on similar sort of theme. A couple of things came out of our research which are at odds with yours. First is the linking between rock art and writing. From my understanding, there's about a 50,000 year gap between them. Language is thought to have risen around about 100,000 years ago. And the second thing is, looking at modern humans, is that the paintings in Spain, I can't remember the names, but there's 3 sites in Spain from about 30,000 years ago. They were done by Neanderthals. So it's not unique to modern humans, to Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
Homo neanderthalensis, if I get the pronunciation correct. So it's just those are a couple of comments.
Thank you, Andrew. No, I completely agree. My bad. It was actually a little bit of nerves where I went and said writing rather than language. So that's huge apologies there. That wasn't in the paper. That was me getting a little bit over enthusiastic with my presentation, and I said writing, but I actually meant language. Yes, yeah, you're right. The Neolithic in Spain and throughout the world, different peoples doing very similar things is what makes rock art really, really interesting, actually. This idea, or different ideas for recording rock art and for symbolism of animals, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you for your response. Let me think. Sorry, Francis is next on my list of hands up there. Francis, can I invite a question, please? Good morning to you.
Good morning. Well, good evening from here. I just wanted to mention that there's also a spiritual dimension that if you look at Australian Indigenous rock art, you see well, Andrew and I seen and others have seen, there's a very strong link between what's recorded in the rock art, religious beliefs, and certainly for Australian Indigenous peoples, because they believe that the spirit of the dead goes into rocks and trees and the earth, and ultimately the rainbow spirit that started the world is in the earth. You can't separate that religious dimension. So I just thought you might want to include something about that, because that's not unique to Australian Aborigines. It's just that happens to be the one I know best.
Yes, thank you, Francis. And in fact, indeed, it is in the paper, and it might even be in one of the slides that I skipped over a little bit speedily. So one of the three areas that we've been looking at is this religious representation, or as you say, the fact that the spirits go into the rocks. And in fact, some of the work that Warren has been doing in South Africa is bringing that out. And again, that was the bit I ended up having to skip over a bit at the end. So yes, thank you very much, Francis. That we do have a little bit in there, but you're right, we need to think a little bit more about that as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Francis, and thank you for your response, Karen. Simon Morris, I can see you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask your question, please?
Thank you. This is not so much a question, but just an observation.
Yeah.
I'm blessed to live in the Northern Territory of Australia, where we have the Kakadu National Park. And of course, rock painting is a great draw for the tourists in Kakadu, but there you'll see buffalo and kangaroos, but also over thousands of years, there were trading routes where the local indigenous populations were trading with the Macassans in Indonesia, and the Macassans would come and get, well, it sounds pretty awful, sea slugs, but they still do, but they're bêche de mer. And in return, they'd barter for things like arrowheads. And some of the rock art, especially in the Kimberley in Western Australia, is really quite fantastic. And sadly, we had an issue last year where some rock art in the cave in the Jukan Gorge was demolished by Rio Tinto, and that was between around about 46,000 years old. So some of the rock art we've got here can go back between 50 and 60,000 years.
That's incredible, isn't it, actually? And again, that's another area that's really, really interesting, is the interplay between the local peoples and tourists, and colonial issues with rock art. And so there's a whole lot of other interesting areas here. Some other colleagues and myself have been doing some stuff looking at the Northern Pacific, so off the coast of Russia, and there sea otters were hunted almost to extinction. In fact, sea cows were hunted to extinction, but that was trade with China. So the furs were sold and bartered, basically, exchanged for silver and opium and all sorts of, and of course you've got the East India Company, where there was lots of trade as well. So it's a whole area that's really, really interesting. Thank you.
If I might just make one other point, going back to the trade between the indigenous peoples in Northern Australia and the Macassans, they quite often would actually go to each other's country. And so you have people in Macassar who, well, there are words in the Macassan language which are indigenous, and we also have Macassan words in some of the local indigenous languages here too.
Really interesting, really interesting.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you very much to you, Karen. Your timing has been perfect yet again. We're just on 9:40. So there are lots and lots more questions I'm sure we could ask. I mean, there are so many issues, but we better move on and give people time for a little break between sessions. So could I just ask you to join me, and even if you're unmuted, in showing your appreciation to Karen, particularly as she stood in at the last moment. So thank you very much, Karen. Okay, we have now a 4-minute break, and then we have Eleonora Mazzeri, who is in the room, I'm pleased to say, starting back at 9:45. So if you'd just like to disappear and fill up your coffee cups or whatever, and we'll see you back in 4 minutes. Thank you very much, everybody. Sorry, but feel free to chat. If anyone would like to say anything or chat, that would be great as well.
Now, Francis is about to come online to chat to you, Alistair.
I'm about to chat to you. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm really looking forward to your paper on the biotapestry. That sounds absolutely fascinating.
Thank you. I actually was just prompted. I was just about saying something to Andrew that, oh, hello, Christopher, that actually came from an email exchange I've recently had with Alan. Are you online, Alan?
Yep.
Okay. The thing that I wanted to discuss was in accounting history, we recognize this breadth of different types of things as accounting. Not just financial accounts, but we see so many different things as accounting. And yet that's not translating over into most of the rest of the accounting community. So the thing that interests me is, how do we present what we are doing in a way that engages people outside the sort of, so that, outside the group, so that we're not just singing to those in the, I'm from the same hymn book, singing with those in the same, who are using the same hymn book. How do you get, and this goes to the broader question of accounting history as well, how do you get people who think that accounting history is not relevant to see value in accounting history?
I think that's an incredibly important question, Francis, and something I think a lot of us have had in the back of our minds, that we deal with an incredibly broad range of themes, which sometimes isn't reflected in mainstream accounting. I'm going to be really rotten and truncate what could be a fantastic discussion there.
I know you have to.
It's 9:45, but we will come back to that. So thank you for that, Francis.
I know you have to. I just wanted to flag it.
Thank you. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you've managed to refill your coffee cups or teacups or water or whatever for the second session here. And could I just ask you just to check, I think everybody is just about on mute, which is great. Our second paper is by Eleonora Mazzieri from the University of Trieste in Italy. And the title is Searching for Regulation in Corporate Narrative, Reporting for Charitable Organizations in the Past and Historical Exploration in Italy and the UK. Eleonora will give you have 25 minutes as usual, and then Shraddha has very kindly offered to be the discussant for 5 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes question and answers. So Eleonora, first off, can I just check that you are unmuted? That's great, you're sharing screen. And I will just give you a little prompt, roughly 2 minutes before the end. So that will be about 8 minutes past 10, just to say that you've got 2 minutes remaining. Is that okay, Eleonora?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much. First of all, this is a joint work, is a 2-head and 4 hands work made with Karen McBride, which presented a few minutes ago. And this work, which ended up in a chapter, which is not published yet, which it ended up in a chapter started because we were talking about the increasing relevance of non-financial narrative communication within firms and on the updated regulation, international regulation on that. And we asked ourselves, well, how was in the past? Did we have similar rules? Was any rule in place for non-financial regulation, or were the company to decide to do that? And so we were chatting about this, and this ended up in this chapter. So as I said a few minutes ago, we all witnesses in the recent decades an increasing interest, not just among academics, but also among practitioners on the relevance of non-financial information. this came with a progressive international harmonization of standards, which were not just financial standards, but also non-financial information standards. Because as I think most of us agree, accounting and accountability are social practice, which which by one side does has an impact on the behavior within organization, but at the same time are affected. Their shape is affected by the local and time-specific context. This international harmonization took on account, and the accounting principle took on account the historical and cultural and different legal system. So at a country level, giving, as we all know, to each country the possibility to adapt within a certain extent these prescriptions. And this ability to adapt is also in the end of the company, and is part of the managerial discretion in what and to what extent disclose. And part of the literature has rightly underlined all the downside of this discretion. Considering accounting from an historical perspective and considering these issues on an historical perspective is of interest for all of us, because it allows us to learn from the past, or having also just a need of what happened and go on and decide if we are doing the right thing, or if we can change for the best. So there is a vast and interesting literature in accounting history about accounting techniques and accounting and also accounting narratives in the past. And here I reported just a few work which gave us the opportunity to explore the accountability practices, to compare the different role of accountability and accounting narratives and accounting as a technical information and their differences within the external communication. And it has been starting from this literature and from everything we have learned from this literature that we ask ourselves a series of questions. First of all, we ask, did the Italian and the UK government and regulator consider the non-financial information at all? Was it mandatory or was it not? And which form and which purpose narrative were expected in the late 19th and early 20th century for public charities in Italy and in the UK? So our chapter provided a cross-country comparison focusing on the regulation. Someone can ask rightly, but why a comparison between Italy and the UK in the past? Well, because at that time, looking at the end of the 19th century allows us to look at the Italian context in a moment when the Italian peninsula was roughly the one that we know nowadays. And when large part of the declaration were being issued and were doing in a homogeneous way in all the peninsula. And by the other way, with respect also to the UK, this allows us to look at the two countries in a moment when, because of the civil law and the common law differences, and because of the social and political difference, there were a great deal of difference between the two countries. So we could really compare something instead of nowadays, for sure, we have much more things in common. Why in the title and then in the chapter, we focus mainly on the charitable institution? Well, because we wanted to test this, so we checked also in our research context exploration, but the literature already advised us that for what regarded the private company, the commercial company, the regulation was not so prescriptive, was not so strict, and it was driven by confidentiality by the government. So we thought from a beginning that we should have had much more space, much more space for movement, but we could have found also much more information in the public sector. So we adopted a qualitative method of analysis and a thematic analysis. We relied on the public archival sources, which are available online. This is the list of the primary documentary sources for the UK side. This is the list of the primary documentary sources for the Italian side, mainly, they are written in Italian, and I'm sorry I didn't translate them, but mainly they are law, they are royal decree, and they are books. So let's start from the Italian side, and then we will move to the UK side. So just a few words about the context. So as most of us know, the Italian kingdom was proclaimed at the end of the 19th century in the 1861, but we have to wait until the 1870 for the Papal State of Rome and the Veneto region, that is the region where I'm coming from, becoming part of the Italian state. Still, the Green Man says us to remember that to speak about Italy as we know today, we have to wait the end of the Second World War. Because of Italy, in that moment, the Italian peninsula was an heterogeneous context with 100 of different idioms and different states being put together. Of course, the newborn Italian government had to rule looking at with a centralization approach. He had to centralize, to homogenize all the different perspectives. So a great deal of regulation started being issued in all the different aspects of the people life. And in the same time, there was a really, from an academic perspective, there was really a fervent environment. And this was true also for the accounting professor. In this period, we have professors like Villa, Cerboni, Besta, which was the teacher of Zappa then. And this is a first stream of a university professor of accounting, which start discussing about them and which start putting in writing the point that accounting is not just a technical fact, but it has also taken account the moral approach of the organization toward the community that it has around and the people that are working inside it. So there is this big discussion that end up arriving to the parliament, because Italy was a constitutional monarchy already at that time. So these discussions were not lived there by themselves, but impacted on the regulation. So during those years, in the 1883, and this was substituting a previous law that was about 1862, the Italian Parliament provided the Code of Commerce. The Code of Commerce provided the disposition for the preparation of the financial statement for commercial enterprises. Now, as I said when I was presenting the paper, it was driven, as also in the English case, in the UK case, by confidentiality in spite of transparency. So the Code of Commerce did not provide specific requirements for the provision of the management report, for sure. And it was, in this regard, it was requiring the administrator just to present to the auditor the financial statement with the supporting documents. But everything was, as I said, driven by confidentiality. So not much narrative to search about. What about the public institution, the charities? Well, this was a different story. Despite that there was a law in the 1862, actually the Prime Minister Francesco Crispi in the 1890 was able to issue a law that actually, with lots of amendments, was Italy was active in Italy until 2001. So it stayed in place for 100 years. Then this law, and so this law was issued. And first of all, it was secularizing all the charitable institution, and as a second, it was providing very strict prescription on what the charitable institution had to provide as a statement. So the law required for any charitable institution to provide by any year the estimated budget, bilancio preventivo, the annual financial statement, conto consuntivo, and the inclusive of the treasurer financial account, conto del tesoriere, and finally our treasure, that is the management report on the result achieved. And the regulation went deeply describing what he was expecting from this part of the annual report of the charities. So what was it expecting? The guideline asked to the charity administrator to narratively report about income, expenses, and financial condition of the organization. More specifically, they were asking the charities to explain how they had managed the charity over the year, all the ordinary and extraordinary events, making a comparison with the previous year, all the relevant information about the personnel, so wages, number, people that were leaving, people that were entering, and the same thing was for the beneficiaries, so for the people that were being helped within the charity. So number of entrants, number of people that were going out, number of deaths, the relationship with the external stakeholders, the changes in the internal regulation, the amelioration, the achievement, all the issue, the economic or moral issue that were facing during the year, the changes that were occurred in the charity. All these aspects were looking at the present in comparison with the past. So what I was expecting was what I planned, and what was actually the result achieved. But it was also asking for planning for the future. In fact, the regulation was asking the manager to explain for the expected and the desiderable future improvement in light of the problem that they had faced during the year, and how they were facing this problem. So which method for increase the productivity or for simplifying the bureaucracy, and how to reduce, and the ways to reduce the expenses, and so on and so forth. A final important requirement of this law was that this law was expressly asking to this organization to account for their relationship with the community in which they were operating. This was an example that I report here was about the extraordinary benefactor and donation, because maybe I wasn't clear before, but I'm saying it now if I didn't, because after this, because this law making this organization public entities was financing. It was the government that was financing this institution, and not anymore the private benefactors. So if there were benefactors that were making donation, these were some extra income that was entering in the organization. So what about England? In England, in this period, we are in the Victorian era. We have the development on the uniformity in accounts, and despite the uniform account was being introduced in the 1870s for the life insurance and in the 71 for the gas company, the uniform account were not widespread and were not favored by legislator. In this account, as in the Italian one for the private company, they were not specified, there were not a specific requirement for narrative reporting for this firm. This lack of, for what regards the British Voluntary Hospital, this organization were instituted in the period between 1720 and 1860s. They existed, of course, also before, and this hospital were funded by a benefactor, subscriptor, and were dependent of also on the public support, and were selective in the people that and in the type of illness that were being assisting. With respect to this type of hospital, the uniform account was advocated by the Institute of the Chartered Accountant in England and Wales and by the Charitable Organization Society. However, this system was not implemented. Still, here he comes, Henry Bunnett. In the 1893, Henry Bunnett introduced the uniform account. Sir Henry Charles Bunnett was a philanthropist, was a hospital reformer. He had worked in the charity administration, so he knew what he was talking about. At the end of the 19th century, Bunnett published a manual outlining his uniform system of accounts for hospital. Because of a combination of social economic factor, so a substantial growth in the hospital care, which was happening also in Italy at that time, and the emergent idea of managerialism, which we find a correspondence also in Italy. These two factors led to the adoption by most of the voluntary hospital of these uniform accounts. So in the uniform accounts, Bunnett observed that this type of institution should have adopted it, not just to demonstrate their activity, to provide account of what they have done and how they had acted during the period, but also to seek and retain the investor in the business of providing hospital services. About narrative, so from a narrative perspective, Bunnett was suggesting to this institution to start the report with an attractive image of the institution and of the work that were being carried out inside this, the specific work that were being carried out within this institution. The manual suggested also for reporting the information about the hospital, the number of beds, the number of patients, information about the staff, the title and the degree of the officers working inside it. It's observed and he pointed out the importance of being precise, of providing detailed information and in being careful in narrating all these facts. So despite the differences in the civil law in Italy and the common law in the UK, regulating and classifying these charities, despite the difference in the, of course, in the context and in the accountability, in the system of accountability that these charities were adopting, some common point can be underlined. The first is that in both countries, at the end of the 19th century, to this type of institution was required to provide a clear information was required to provide the description of the context in which they were operating. And the description of the context was also a moral matter. It was not just related to financial aspect, even if the narrative in both countries, this narrative could have served also to explain the financials, the numbers.
2 minutes remaining, Eleonora.
2 minutes, perfect. Thank you very much. In both countries, requirement ask for rendering accountability about the relationship with the community in which they were operating. And as I said a minute ago, I'm sorry, to integrate the accounting information and not just to substitute the accounting information itself. So, how we hope to have contributed to our field of research. By one side, we hope to have provided an interesting example of how two different countries operated to ensure that no financial information was corroborating the accounting numbers. And by the other, I think this, our work stands as an example. And nowadays, at least in Italy, there is a great deal of discussion if no financial information should be made mandatory also for small and medium enterprises, and about the relevance, the upside and the downside of non-financial information. Despite, as we all know, is already mandatory for all big entities. So I think that this example that we provide shows, as already 100 and 150 years ago, providing explanation, non-financial explanation of the moral moral action, the moral conduct, and by one side, and on the impact on the society and on the environment in which the organization is working was considered relevant, was considered important. So our hope is that this work is a drop in an ocean of ideas for making mandatory the integrative non-financial information and narrative information to all the type of entities in every country. And I finished.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Eleonora. That was fascinating, and I think this is very much more than a drop in a sea or an ocean of ideas or whatever. Thank you very much for that fascinating comparison of what was happening in Italy and the UK. I shan't say anything further at the moment, but I'm delighted to invite Shraddha Verma. Thank you very much for agreeing to act as discussant for this paper. I'll hand over to you, Shraddha.
Hi, Eleonora, and everyone again. Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation, and something that really speaks to a current topic, and it's really interesting to look back in time and explore these issues. Also like to say it's really good to have these international comparisons, it was a great presentation, and I really enjoyed reading your paper. I think obviously the paper, the chapter was a work in progress, and some of my comments and questions you touched upon more in the presentation, and I think it would be really helpful to re-look at the chapter and try and highlight particular things and include. So I'll just briefly go through, and I'm aware that not everyone has the opportunity to read the paper, so just bear with me on that one. I think it was a really interesting paper, but I think within the chapter there could be a tighter link between the research questions that you set up at the front, and the analysis and discussion at the end. I think a little bit of work needs to be done to marry those two up a little more, and they were in the presentation, but I think the paper needs a bit of tightening. I think it's really interesting to the comparison, but I think within the chapter, including something more on why you're comparing specifically Italy and the UK could be highlighted more. And again, you covered that in the presentation. It's interesting also that one country took a very legal route, and one country had much more a laissez-faire route. I mean, and I guess that, echoes, current practices as well. But did you have an opportunity to see how either the voluntary stuff in the UK that Burdett was saying, or the law that was saying in Italy, was actually adopted in practice? And what were the actual practices seen in the different systems? Did the mandatory system lead to these institutions giving more? Or actually, was it the laissez-faire approach? So I think that's the other thing that could be brought out, the impact of different approaches on the practices that were actually seen, rather than what Burdett was saying and what the law was saying. And so somehow speaking to the effectiveness of regulation, I guess, and whether sometimes laissez-faire approaches are possibly as effective in the space. Also, I think one final thing, I think in the paper, perhaps, reflecting a little bit more or highlighting a little bit more the socioeconomic contexts that the countries were in, and the impact that had on the accounting, very much focusing on charitable organizations, because sometimes you in the draft I saw anyway, the narrative disclosure bit is more general than related to charities, so making it a little bit more specific. And then just building one question from something that came out in the presentation. Eleonora, you said that in Italy it seemed that they were moving from religious-based institutions to secular institutions, or did I miss the point there? And I thought that the impact of religion on charitable institutions was an interesting aspect.
So, first of all, if you missed anything, this is my bad, because that means that I didn't explain myself clearly. And then, first of all, again, thank you very much for all your comments. Very much appreciated. I hope I take all the notes, but I'm sure that Karen is like Superman, so for sure she also took notes about that. So to respond to your question immediately, many charities in the Italian context, many charities. For instance, one that I studied during my PhD were centuries old. Some of those were religious institutions. We may say that the most probably were religious institutions. Not all of them. For instance, the Foundling Hospital of Padua, which I studied during my PhD, was a laical institution, and it was such since the 13th century. Okay, so the point is that before this law was issued in the end of the 19th century, these charitable institutions were private entities. So they could have been of the church. They could have been supported by a specific group of benefactors, or they can be supported also by the town hall, but they were private. what the government, what the regulation, and I'm sorry if I didn't stop enough, did first of all before ruling on the accounting perspective was placing them under the Prime Minister, the internal ministry, control, under the government control. And this has also, this answer also to another point of yours, that was the effectiveness of the regulation. So the system of control that was put in place with this regulation was extremely strict, where created the prefects, which were ruling over each provinces, and in this period were also being created the provinces, which are still existing today. So there was Venice and the province of Venice, there was Padua and the land of Padua, we may say the land. So there was this ruler, there were this ruler of each land, and this ruler had to control each charity. The charity had to report the annual report directly to them each year, and they were controlling the annual report, and they were saying if there were amendment to be done, or if they were okay. And because it was the central government to pay each charity, and by the way of the provinces and the town hall, they should have not received any money. And actually, they could have encountered a strong problem if they were not behaving as such. So since the issue of this law, there was a very strong control over this institution. I hope I have answered.
Yeah, it's just some observations, and thank you.
Thank you, Eleonora. I'm just and thank you very much for your analysis there, Shraddha. We've just got time for possibly one, possibly two quick questions before we stop for our next 5-minute break. And sorry, Bill Jackson, I see you've got your hand up. Can I invite you to speak, please? Morning, Bill.
Morning, Alistair. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks, Eleonora, for a really interesting paper. I know very little about the Italian side of things. I do know quite a lot about the UK side of things. One thing I would say, in your presentation, you spoke about in the 1890 ICAW promoted the uniform accounts, and then this is something that comes out in Neil Robson's paper. He implies that Burdett picked up on what the ICAW did, and it's just wrong. There's actually significant evidence that Burdett was promoting the uniform accounting system back in, he actually devised it in 1869 at Queen's Hospital in Birmingham. And Robson said there's no real evidence for this, but there is. He just didn't look. I think he wanted to tell a story about the ICAW. So that was one thing. And the other thing is that you're quite right. In the UK context, this is all about voluntary disclosure from the charities, but it's kind of not voluntary in a sense, because they were absolutely reliant on donations, and there was no way they could get any donations unless they made this disclosure. So there is pressure to disclose, and the charities very much, we're talking about the voluntary hospitals that Burdett was interested in, that started to they started to open in 1720 with the Westminster Hospital. And throughout the 2 centuries, more or less, that ran up to this point, they had a very, very, what should we say, they were very individualistic in the way that they developed the accounting information and presented that. And it was all, basically, it was a marketing piece to try and attract funding. And what Burdett was trying to do was trying to get some comparability and consistency into the presentation, so that you spoke earlier on about managerialism. So they were trying to create a sense of being able to understand just how these hospitals performed against each other for the level of funding that they got, and that was a really, really important.
Bill, can I butt in there?
I'll stop.
Thank you very much for those important points. Sorry, Elena.
Thank you very much.
Give you a chance to respond. Bill, I think the point on the ICAW is very well. They're both very important points. If I could ask if you could possibly email those details to Leonora. I'm sure that would be very useful. I see one other person has got their hand up, Lorenzo. If you can just do it in about 15 seconds, is that okay? And then
yes,
we'll
thank you, Alistair. Thank you, Alistair. Just a point, congratulations to Eleonora for the presentation. I've seen that in your presentation, in the management report in Italy, they mention the word stakeholder, and it comes to me really interesting because it comes earlier, 1 century before the linguistic definition in the UK. So maybe a fruitful venue of future research could be to address from linguistic different perspectives how we manage the expression in English stakeholder in other linguistic patterns, maybe just at that point. So thank you for the presentation again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. Leonora, I'm going to be very rude and not give you an opportunity to respond, but I would encourage you to pursue this via email. Can I just ask everyone to join me in thanking Leonora very much and Shraddha for her commentary. And we've got 2 minutes, so I shall invite you to go and fill up your coffee cups again, and then we will begin. We've got Chris Napier and theories and accounting history, or their relevance or their use to come back to. So we've got something to look forward to in 2 minutes. So see you in a couple of minutes. Gives me great delight to welcome to introduce Christopher Napier from Royal Holloway College or University of London. And his paper is entitled How Theorizing Can Enhance Historical Accounting Research. So again, could I just ask everyone to make sure that you are on mute? Christopher, you've got 25 minutes, and at about 10:48, I will just shout out 2 minutes to go. Then we'll have 5 minutes. Greg Stoner has very kindly agreed to be the discussant for this, 5 minutes of that, and then 5 minutes for general questions and answers. So Christopher, can you, I can see your screen. I don't think I've heard you yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much. And good morning to you and welcome. And I always want to go and visit people when I see their bookshelves behind them. You're about the third lot this morning, and it looks like there's some interesting, very interesting stuff there. Anyway, I'll shut up and let you get on, Christopher.
Yes, the key thing is there are no accounting books in my study at home. Okay, now the background to this paper is a couple of papers that I've been involved with. One of these was with Karen and Gary Carnegie and Lee Parker, and that was published in British Accounting Review a year or so ago, where we looked at how accounting history approaches have helped in our understanding of organizations in general. And so the key emphasis was theorizing about organizations. And then more recently, we had the Accounting History virtual workshop, which was sort of the substitute for what was going to be the Accounting History International Conference in Portsmouth back in September, where Carolyn Cordery, Delfina Gomez, Julia Leone, Karen and myself produced a sort of panel paper looking at sort of directions for historical accounting research. And one of the themes we talked about there was sort of new approaches to theorization in accounting history. Now, one of the things that we noted in the paper that was published in British Accounting Review was the great explosion in theorization, which began in accounting history, at least in the English language literature, in the 1980s. And that was very much driven by Anthony Hopwood in particular, and his argument that we should study accounting in the context in which it operates rather than studying it just as an abstract technical phenomenon, but also his view that a lot of historical accounting research in the past had been atheoretical. And so he was calling for more theory to inform accounting history research and putting that into practice by publishing papers in accounting organizations and society that were heavily theorized and which basically was subsequently named the New Accounting History. So I thought I'd begin by looking at what we really mean by these terms, theory and theorization. I went to my dictionary, and I found that this is the Chambers Dictionary, and I found that theory can be described as an explanational system of anything, an exposition of the abstract principles of a science or art, and then things that are possibly less convincing for our sort of work. Theory is speculation as opposed to practice, or theory that is an idea that has not yet been proved, it's a conjecture. So these are dictionary definitions of theory, and so they're understandings of how the word theory is used in practice in the English language. It's not just sort of understandings we would apply, which would be that a theory is an explanation or it's an abstraction of the principles of accounting, say, but it's also something that may be slightly more negatively an idea of speculation rather than the practical activity. Theorization is, or theorizing is forming a theory, but then it also has the negative sense that it could be just coming up with arguments that are based entirely on theories in the secondary sense that they're conjectures or speculation. So theorizing is the process by which we arrive at a theory. And theories typically deal with variables and the relationship between these variables, and they operate at a level of abstraction. So a theory that simply repeats perhaps a description isn't really a theory at all. Theory is abstracting, which means we're taking things from the practical description of phenomena and representing them in terms perhaps of concepts. When we develop theories, we could start, before we actually go into the field and gather data, gather archival material, for example, we could have a sort of a priori theory, which is arrived at by thought processes. We think about things, and then we would typically try and test this theory. The theory would generate hypotheses or propositions, and we see the extent to which these hypotheses or propositions are supported in the real world. Or we could develop theories a posteriori. We sometimes talk about inductive theories, but these tend to be theories where we have a large set of data and we look for patterns and regularities in the data. But we can also try and come up with some sort of explanatory structure, an abstract structure for a specific case. And in many cases, and I'll talk about this later, theorization can involve both aspects. We can have perhaps an outline or basic theory that we begin with, and then we try and develop that theory and make it richer and more explanatory and more specific as we go through our research. Now, over the years, various writers have tried to come up with frameworks or systems to help us to think about different ways of theorizing. I'm going to talk about three of these briefly. The first one of these was developed by an American organizational theorist called Anne Langley, and this was called 7 Styles of Sense-Making. And then we have 5 levels of theorizing developed by Sue Llewellyn. This is a structure that we used in the British Accounting Review paper to try and interpret different approaches to theorizing about organizations. And then we have 4 conceptions of history and organization studies. And this was developed by Mario McLean, Charles Harvey, and Stuart Clegg a few years ago in a paper in Academy of Management Review. So we've gone from 7 to 5 to 4, and perhaps the next one will be 3 concepts of theorizing, or 2 concepts, something like that. But certainly we seem to be getting more and more economic in terms of the number of levels or concepts we're talking about. 7 styles of sense-making, then, first of all. Anne Langley talks about these different ways of she uses the word sense-making. She also calls them approaches to theorizing. And the first one of these is narrative. Because it's important to remember that when we are writing a story, even if we just want to write an individual story, there will be a certain amount of sort of behind-the-scenes theorizing going on. We will be applying our notions of cause and effect, for example. We don't just say X happened and then Y happened. We say X happened and then this led to Y happening. So there's some degree of causation going on there. We also have views about human agency and the importance of agency in structures. This happened because X, an individual, played an important role, or X thought this, or X did that, or X wanted to do that. We have ideas of motivation. Some of these may be informed by very broad theoretical notions, like the idea of the rational economic person making decisions. How we tell the story also involves certain choices that we can consider to be a sort of type of theorization. Is this a story of that tells us a narrative of progress? Are we telling a story things are getting worse? Perhaps there was a golden age, or where people really could do accounting properly, but subsequent events have meant that the accounting we do today is not as effective or efficient. So narrative sense-making, telling the story in itself, has a sort of theoretical underpinning. At the other extreme, we have quantification, where we come up with numerical models to try and give us an understanding of the relationship between different variables by measuring these variables and setting up perhaps formal models by which different variables in combination affect the measure of some other variable, a sort of dependent variable. A third approach to making sense is applying what Anne Langley calls alternate templates. And this is the sort of situation where we might draw on different theoretical frameworks or different conceptions or different ideas and see which of these helps us to explain better, or perhaps combine together to provide an overall explanation. So we might explain a particular situation by referring to the sort of rational economic behavior of actors in the situation, or we might find that the structures within which people are operating constrain behavior, and therefore we need to have a combination of agency and structure in our explanations. Langley mentions grounded theory as a way of sense-making where we don't just try and tell a story, but we look at our historical material, at our evidence, and we try to find themes or categories that we can code and that we can manipulate our codes to come up with some sort of higher level abstract explanation of what's going on. Visual mapping as a way of representing the relationships that are going on, and possibly these relationships changing through time. So that we can have a sort of pictorial representation or model of what is going on in the phenomena we're trying to talk about. Temporal bracketing, where we come up with some sort of periodization, where we see phenomena perhaps changing over time, and we try and understand why things change, how things change, when things change. And finally, a sort of synthesis where we bring together the evidence that we get from many different sort of situations in our archival material, in our empirical material, and we try to come up with, perhaps inductively, some sort of overarching explanation that helps us to understand what's going on and can be applied in other cases. So sense-making can have various different criteria that help us to understand what makes a good theory. One of these is accuracy. That is, how much of the empirical detail does the theory actually preserve? Now, a theory that is 100% accurate isn't really a theory, because it is basically just the description of the empirical phenomenon, the archival material. But many theories, particularly quantified theories, because we focus only on what we can measure in a situation, lose a lot of accuracy, but the aim there is more to try and achieve generality. How wide is the range of situations to which the theory can be applied? And some people see generality as the absolute goal of theorizing, but the danger is that a theory can be almost too general. A theory can explain perhaps too much, but the only way that we get these explanations is by forcing the empirics into a very narrow perspective, and so we lose much of the richness of accuracy. And then a third criterion is simplicity. A theory that has many different variables, many different relationships is complex to understand and apply, possibly may have a high degree of accuracy, but the more elements in the theory, the more clumsy it is to try and apply it and understand it. But on the other hand, a simple theory, which perhaps has a few key factors and elements, may lose a lot of the empirical richness. So that's 7 styles of sense making. What about 5 levels of theorizing? Well, Sue Llewellyn wrote her paper back in 2003, where she introduced these 5 levels of theorizing because she was concerned that people had a very narrow view of what a theory was. And this was the sort of theory that might be drawn from perhaps the natural sciences. A very high level of abstraction, a great deal of simplicity, but one that did not take into account adequately the contexts in which research phenomena emerged and in which research took place. And she argued that she identifies 5 levels. The first one of these is theory as metaphor. And here what we do is we take the empirical data, the archival material that we found, and we explain it by translating it into new sorts of language, using words that are in a sense carried from another context. Many years ago, I wrote a paper about the P&O group, the big shipping group in the 1920s and 1930s. And I noted how the metaphor that was used by management for describing the relationship between the parent company P&O and the various companies that it owned changed from a metaphor of alliance to a metaphor of subsidiarity. And I noted how the words used, the metaphors used, actually changed the way in which the relationship operated. The second level, and the word level, I think, is slightly misleading because it implies some sort of hierarchy, as if level 1 theories are less important or significant than level 2, 3, 4, 5 theories. The second level is theory as differentiation, where we differentiate between different phenomena. This could be a dualism. We could come up with 2 differences, or we could have more than 2 categorizations. The allies and subsidiaries metaphor is in a sense a theory of differentiation as well, because it's coming up with different contexts, and we're saying that in each context things operate in a different way. Theory is conceptualization, and this is where we try to impose a certain amount of organization on the data to come up with ideas that have, or we hope have, more general applicability, that can be used not just in the context in which we're operating, but in other contexts, in other types of research. Llewellyn argues that this level of theorization is about the highest level of theory where we can be talking about individuals, because level 4, theory as contextualization, is more a theory of settings, more a theory of how organizations and phenomena like accounting operate in a broad context rather than just in understanding the practices and activities of individuals. And finally, we have theory as total explanation, a sort of grand theory that might be summed up by just mentioning the name of an individual like Marx or Weber or Foucault or somebody like that, or Habermas, that tries to apply not just in specific circumstances, but basically to all of space and all of time, to society in general. Recently, there was a paper published in Accounting History by Paolo Ferri and others that analyzed 1,300 accounting history papers published between 1996 and 2015, and they grouped together the first two levels, metaphor and differentiation, as sort of theory as narrative. And what they find, and it didn't really surprise me too much, was that this is the most significant way they found that accounting historians try to develop a sort of abstract, theorized understanding of what they're doing. They tell a story, but the story is structured and the story draws on terms and concepts. Theory as conceptualization is the next most common. They find much less use of grand theories. And that supports the analysis that Carnegie and Karen and Lee Parker and myself also came up with in our British Accounting Review paper. What about four conceptions of history? This is down to Mary McLean and others, and they argue that using history in organizational studies, there are two important dimensions. First one of these is the purpose of the study. Are we trying to simply set out in a structured way information about the past, or are we trying to interpret that information to give us insight into contemporary practices? They also argue that there are two main modes of using history. One of these is basically social scientific. So we're really just we're doing social science on old data. And the other is they identify as narrative. This is more the history, the story in itself has value, not just for what it tells us about today, but also about what it tells us about the past. And this gives us a 2x2 matrix, 4 different conceptions. The first one of these is history as evaluating. And here we're using historical data to help us to test contemporary theories and also to help us to refine those theories, to give us greater clarification and understanding about what we're doing today. History as explicating is where we use the historical material to help us to develop theory, but the aim of the theory is to help us to understand how things change, how social processes transform. History is conceptualizing. We're using historical data to help us to generate new theoretical constructs, understand new concepts, which may have application in today's research, but also help us to understand the past. And then history is narrating, where, as they say, theory is behind the scenes. Theory is operating off stage, but it helps us to tell these stories. And the way in which the theorization may come into play is that it gives us an understanding that we can apply not just to the past, but to contemporary phenomena. Now, very often we might, as we do a historical study, deal with history in different ways. So we might start off by telling a story, and then, so we're doing history as narrating. We then may try to find some grand theory or broad theory that helps us to evaluate. But then,
left, Chris.
Thank you. That theory may turn out to be difficult to apply because it's too general, and so we may need to develop new concepts, new constructs, and then we apply those new constructs to study change. So that takes us on to theorizing in accounting history research. Of course, we all begin with some sort of prior theoretical grounding. We have no existing theories and concepts. We may have sketchy theories, skeletal theories that help us in formulating the initial research questions. The archive, we might already have identified an archive we're interested in. We know that there's a rich archive before we even start to think about questions to ask, but identifying what material in an archive is relevant may well draw on some of our prior skeletal theoretical understanding. We need to sort out the archival material, so that may involve developing timelines, chronologies. Close reading of the archival material will give us insights into what was going on, and we may try and sort of systematize through some sort of formal theoretical analysis and coding, but this itself will depend on theory. then we might look around for existing theoretical ideas, or we might try and develop our new theoretical frameworks. And to finish, the theorizing stage involves this theoretical development, taking concepts from elsewhere, refining those concepts in the light of our specific archive, our specific analysis, possibly developing new models and frameworks. It's not so necessary if we think that existing frameworks will help, but we need to push our frameworks to try and get some sort of richness. And at all stages, we need to review our theories. We need to make sure that our theories remain based on the facts, based on the archival material, and that we are aware that archival material often needs to be interpreted, and that may involve bringing in theoretical ideas. And we need to be sensitive to the context in which we're operating. But the overall role of theory and theorization is that we start perhaps with a narrative that is local in space and time. We want to make this a wider argument. And ideally, this argument should have some sort of contemporary resonance. That doesn't necessarily mean we're simply present-minded, we're just interested in current problems. But what we find in the past should have echoes, should have some sort of way of informing debates that are happening in the present. So theory and theorization can enhance historical research and accounting by providing us with a way of structuring our narratives, thinking about what our narratives are telling us about broader issues, and giving us this link between the past and the present. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed for that. I think you've given us all a lot to think about as we move forward with our research. But I'm going to hand straight over to Greg, who has very kindly agreed to be the discussant today. Greg, yeah, you've unmuted. That's great. You've got approximately 5 minutes before question and answers. Thank you, Greg.
Hi, okay, I'm sharing the screen. I don't know if that's worked or not.
Yes, it has.
Okay. Yeah, it's really interesting because it's made me readdress and rethink of some of the things that I might have been thinking about before. So I enjoyed reading it yesterday. I did only get it basically yesterday. I think it's Sunday evening, was it? So I kind of assume it's a slightly early draft. So I hope I'm not criticising too much. But anyway, so what it does, it brings together two old ideas, which I think probably many of us are aware of, but if you're not, they're interesting ideas. And this slightly newer one, which I must admit I'd not really looked at least not recently anyway. I think I might have looked at it when it came out, but I certainly haven't read it in any detail before yesterday. So, and in relation to accounting history, what can be done, reinterpretation, how could or should theorization be used? I really like that last quotation. I think it's great. I'm not so sure that the contemporary resonance is necessary in some senses. I can understand why you're saying it, and your explanation in that just a minute ago was kind of made some argument to say that had to be the case, but I'm not sure that we necessarily have to be contemporary to be important. But it's a shame that I don't see you actually say that in the paper, not at least in quite as direct a way, which I think would make it clearer if you did. I think the exposition of the frameworks is pretty clear. You do need the diagram, but I suspect you didn't have time to whack it in. And I like it that there is no explicit message, at least that accounting history has to have theory. I'm kind of slightly worried that you might be meaning that, but you don't say. I do think there's a role for accounting histories that don't have theory, although generally I think they're better if they do, but that's another issue. I think I've seen some points of critique, and I'll go through these very briefly, really. I mean, could there be more critique of these particular frameworks? For example, I think you give Sue Llewellyn a bit of a give me by saying it's ambiguous. It's clear she chose to use the word levels because in the early parts of the paper she uses forms or types. So I don't really think it's ambiguous. I think there's kind of notes in there to try and let people think it's ambiguous. And I wonder how that relates and how we could critique that in the context of the role of academic judgment in particular, in the way that other people might rate our work. I think therefore we can't really talk about those levels without being critical of them in some sense, because there is an implication that grand theories are better than the things below it. I also, thinking about Langley's stuff, I got really annoyed by the bit about visual mapping, and I went back to the paper to look at it too, but I don't think it's just representation. I think visual mapping is an essential part of communication. The fact that you really need that 2x2 diagram from McLean, etc. stuff is part of that. I mean, and I think perhaps that's something that's really missing in the narration in general within your discussion, and perhaps something more could be said about that. In your presentation, you said a bit about it, and in the paper towards the end, you talk about the dynamics of phasing in McLean's types. And when I read that, I thought, so what? You explained it better in the presentation, I think. But how does, and I was, in a sense, moving between phases, I'll get the words wrong, from those different boxes. Yeah, I can see that we do that, but how does the discussion of that, in a sense, help us in the process of theorizing? And I think perhaps there's some more depth to be said there. And I did wonder if there could be more synthesis or development of those ideas within the paper. I don't know if that's what you're intending or not, really. A couple of more points. And one is the use of examples. I don't really know that they add. You talk in relation to Langley, I think it is, about particular examples of the types of work, and then it sort of runs out. I think there's a bit of a narrow field too. I think there are nearly all works which you've been involved in writing, which is perhaps because they're convenient. But I do wonder what the purpose of the examples is. I think in the paper, in the BAR paper, I think the examples have a role, but I didn't see them having much of a role in this paper. I think this work by Ferry, etc., is really weird, and I don't understand why you rely on it or even refer to it very much, because I don't really think it says very much about the theorizing that it says it does. But that's my personal problem with that particular type of topic modeling work, which is highly abstract, and I think those categorizations that they use for theories at the bottom of that table are really weird. Just look at the words that are used to call them theoretical. Anyway, and it looks a bit like it's retrofitted learning. I was not involved in the review, so I don't know, but it looks like it's been added at the end because somebody said they needed to, but I don't know. Or it might be because I criticised their previous work because it didn't do it. Anyway, and finally, very briefly, I'd like to see a bit more in this representational truth and context sensitivity stuff. There's a couple of paragraphs towards the end, and I'd like to see more support for that argument that context can enhance generalization, which is going back to your closing statement and my opening one about showing things. The other thing, and the thing which I really liked, was this notion of a bridge between a specific story and a general concerns. It's not a term I've used with students when I've talked research methodology, but it's the idea that I've been talking to students about for many years. And I think it's something which people don't really get sometimes, about why theory is useful to make that bridge, to make a specific story more general. And I'd like to see a bit more in terms of development of examples, so that is a bit more insightful to people. And lastly, this is just a critique really of the way the paper's written. I think you've got 5 conclusions in the last paragraph, and I found it very difficult to in my mind, trace those back to the things earlier in the paper. What's more, I think that message that you ended your presentation with is probably more fundamental than any of those 5 points. but that's my personal view, and I hope you don't find that too critical. I will send you these slides.
Sorry, can I interrupt you there? Just because we're starting to run out of time.
I'm finished.
Thank you very much. You've finished. That's great. And I just wanted to give Chris a chance to respond if there is anything he wanted to say on any of your comments there.
I think they're really valuable comments. Thank you very much, Greg. As you probably sort of guessed, the paper was rather thrown together at the last minute, and apologize for not giving you more time to read it, but you've really been very helpful there. And I would, if we have time for a couple of questions, I look forward to those. By the way, I should say that if anybody would like a copy of the paper and or the slides, send me an email and I'll send you a copy.
Thank you very much. We do have one quick question. I know we're overrunning, so Andrew Reed, if you could keep it to as briefly as you could, please. But I'd like to ask you for your question or comment, please, Andrew.
Okay, I'll just do one then.
Yeah.
For Christopher, responding to what Greg said about not necessarily to theorise, is it possible not to theorise? Just because you don't write about a theory doesn't mean you're not applying one. You just may not know about it.
Well, I think there are 2 points that possibly I need to bring out more strongly in the paper. One of these is that even just what we think is telling a story involves certain sort of theorizations about how we see the world working and what's going on. And secondly, we will bring the sort of baggage of our past reading and past experience and so on to situations. So we might look at new situations through theoretical lenses, not necessarily being fully conscious of it. In the paper, I refer to your study with Francis at the Founding Hospital. And that paper begins with the sentence where you talk about stigma and you cite the work of Goffman. But I was wondering whether you actually started, before you even went into the archive, with that theoretical concept in mind, or whether it was something that, because of course it'd been written about in the literature before, or whether it was something that you found helped to make sense of what you found in the archive.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to interrupt there because I know some people do have to get off. We're supposed to finish just after 11. As usual, I think there's a big debate that could carry on, and people are very welcome to stay online for a little longer. But at this point, can I just say thank you very much indeed for Christopher for your presentation. Thank you very much to Greg for acting as discussant. And if you could all just join me in saying thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to hand over to, are you there, Matt?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Yes, Matt, who is going to conclude the proceedings. Thank you very much, Matt.
Oh, thanks, Alistair. Thanks, everyone, for your presentation. Especially Karen, thanks very much for stepping in the last minute. That was very good. Thank you very much. We enjoyed that presentation. And Eleonora, thanks so much for your presentation, and Chris as well. I would thank our reviewers as well for making our time to produce some very helpful comments. This is the best way we can actually improve the accounting history research group. Please feel free, if you have any papers you are working on and you want to submit this for our next workshop, please do that. We welcome those very much. Our next workshop in February will be on the 15th. So this will be by our Japanese colleagues. So we look forward to that, 15th of February. We have as well another workshop slated for 15th as well in March. Just to remind you that our accounting history group, we have a LinkedIn forum. Please, if you haven't joined yet, try to join because we share some information there just to make sure that you don't miss out on any sort of information. Now, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And let me also congratulate our new executive. Karen is our new chair of the group, and Alan is now the deputy chair, and of course Treda is our secretary. So thank you very much and congratulations to all of you. Thank you.
I think Francis was trying to tell me that you did actually begin with the idea of stigma, did you?
Yeah, we always theorize, as I believe it's really important. I know not everybody believes that. I've actually had this discussion with Carolyn Fowler, who has said that Accounting History, the journal, will never demand a theory that there is always a theory in papers. I actually think it's essential, and I also think it's how I approach research. But also, I think it's important for accounting history, because I think if we are going to give accounting history credibility and raise the profile of accounting history, then there are some things we need to engage with. And for me, theory takes it out of just one-off historical cases. So in some shape or form, I personally think we need to engage with theory, but I actually have a question for you. And my question comes from something that the late Kerry Jacobs, God rest his soul, believed strongly and wrote about. Probably, it might have been in CPA, but it's probably in AAAJ because that was his main publication source, and I haven't read it for a while. Kerry wrote about how and believed that accountants are not in the business of developing theory. We're in the business of taking existing theories and sort of showing the practical import of them, showing how they apply in reality. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, I think that's a very important aspect of theory, and in fact, I think it's what a lot of us do in practice. That we look for theories that possibly have been developed in other social sciences and see how these help us to understand the accounting or the phenomena we're particularly interested in. But I think this is where we've got to remember that you know, theorization within accounting, the sort of theorization that might be represented by, say, a conceptual framework in accounting, is something that accountants can do, and possibly we've been the social science turn in accounting research in the 70s and 80s has taken us a bit away from. So I can see that there is a role for theorization in accounting in trying to not just understand but improve the practice of accounting. And I don't necessarily see that draws on other areas of social sciences, although perhaps things like conceptual frameworks and statements of principles sort of do behind the scenes, because they have ideas sort of driven by economic decision making and so on.
Thank you. I have another question, if I may. Andrew and I have recently been working on a different way of understanding basically what's being considered isomorphism in accounting. And we've been looking at when it isn't an isomorphic response, but in two discrete areas, we see the same thing happening. And what we've been looking at are the accounting practices in Japan and accounting before the Western influence, and accounting practices in Britain. And we turned to evolutionary biology. Andrew, you might want to step in. And we've been looking at convergent evolution as another way of explaining this. And I was wondering whether you thought perhaps, while sociology is really useful because it explains how groups in society operate, perhaps we're being too narrow by focusing primarily on sociology.
I think that's a very, very interesting and provocative question. And I'd really like to give it a lot of thought rather than come up with a glib response. I think it's interesting you talk about evolution, because this has been used as a sort of, I'm not sure whether it's a metaphor or a concept or whatever, the classic book of Littleton's Accounting Evolution to 1900 is an example there. But I think that there have been problems in some people who've used that term without really understanding how evolution is used in biology. So I think we don't have to draw entirely on social sciences in general. We can look to other ideas.
I'm quite interested in your idea, Francis, that you have to have a theory. I mean, obviously you have a perspective that you arrive at your research with, but I have also noticed that when we talk about accounting history, a lot of what we say is, oh, that's really interesting. Oh, that's really interesting. And I'm just wondering if there's a place for being more historic in our approach. So traditional history tends not to have theories, and we seem to have got ourselves in a position where if we want to publish in the top journals, we have to have a theory. Therefore, we tend to think we have to have a theory, whereas traditional history doesn't have theories. It produces findings and narratives and interprets and tells the story. Obviously, I'm not saying just tell a story. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying with evidence, with background, using those archives. And I think sometimes we find ourselves in a place where we end up using theory to explain something, and we're not necessarily applying the right theory, or we're just trying to apply a theory because we need to get something published. And personally, I go backwards and forwards on this. So I'd be quite interested to see what other people think about whether we should be doing it the classical history way, or whether, because we're accountants, we should be following the rules and using theory.
Can I say, I think it's impossible to completely bracket out all theory in any discussion, in any communication or any analysis. What would worry me is if we produced a hegemony where we have to explicitly talk about theory. I do think in general, I find things more convincing when people are explicit about their theory, because it makes it more obvious where they're coming from. But I just wouldn't like to say that everybody has to have theory, otherwise their work doesn't count, because I think that's just part of a ranking system which I don't really want to be involved in.
Can I just add to that when I look at medieval history more than anything else, and medieval accounting history is completely lost because it doesn't look at any of the context surrounding the things that are happening. And as I look at early modern, the same thing's going on. The nearer you get to the present day, the more of the context is looked at. But there's never enough context looked at anything before the 20th century. And as a result, even if you use the best theory in the world, you're just guessing as to whether or not it's 100% the best or the right one. So your conclusions are always going to be at risk. If someone comes along and says, well, look at what was actually going on. How can that theory possibly relate to what you're talking about? And we don't even think of that. And
that's why I'd like Christopher to have said more about the context stuff at the end of the paper, to be honest, because I agree with you, the anachronism of, or what present-mindedness, and which dominates a lot of what we read is problematic, I think, and that context issue is therefore important. And I think theory is one way of going back to the past, but it's not the only way. I don't think we have. I wouldn't want to be the person who says, if it doesn't have theory, then it doesn't count. Because I just think that's the wrong way to do things.
I think our
I
problem
can
is
challenge
the
that.
definition of theory. Sorry, Andrew. Can I just say, I think the problem is the definition of theory, because, Alan, I would say that your work is very well theorized, but it's not a theory in the sense of you've done this and, oh, wow, another Foucault paper. But I would say that internally, I mean, the world has enough Foucault papers in accounting in my eyes, but anyway, that's a different story. But I would say that you theorize your work very well, because what you are doing is you're developing an explanation that to me is a theory in itself. And I see that in the better traditional histories as well. Andrew, sorry, you were going to say something.
Okay. One of the things I want to say was when Karen said, oh, that's interesting, you have a theory about why that is interesting, even if you haven't worked out what that theory is. Everything we have is based on our ideas and concepts, which are theories. Now, if we're talking about that level of theorization, everything is theory. But people don't often address what they're talking about, what their backgrounds are and what their prejudices are and all those things. And that's where non-theorizing, I think, is problematical. Because people address what they're coming from, their context and the reasons, then we're getting better papers. To say that we have to do something like that, oh, this is Foucault, or this is Barth, or this is agency theory, or something like that. No, that's not necessary. That forcing things into those sorts of things can actually be harmful. And I wouldn't support that. Certainly they have their place and they can be very valuable,